Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. I just forgot to put my phone on silent, so that's why I looked a little distracted at the start of this. My name is Ben, and this is
all those calls you're gonna get at 8 o'clock on a
it technically
weeknight.
was an eBay notification for a Pokemon card. So
Oh right, that's much more your speed. You know,
yeah, that's exactly.
Is that too mean?
Right, no, it's spot on. It's just right at that moment I go a little ding. I'm Ben. You are.
I'm Jim.
And this is our podcast where we watch movies and inflict them upon each other.
And this is our podcast, he says.
This week we watched The Great Escape.
And I have to say, after watching The Great Escape, I feel great about my choice. Can I just say,
top tier. Like, I had a tear brought to my eye thinking, this is such a great movie, and I picked such a bad movie the week before.
Yeah, it was definitely a palate cleanser after Gremlins 2, you know,
so good.
But look, I'll be honest here. I picked The Great Escape because it's a film that I have seen sections of a lot.
Yep.
And I was reflecting in the sort of, the lead up to what will I pick. I was reflecting, I'm like, I don't think I've ever sat down and just watched it from, the opening to the end in one go, and it was to the point where I was like, I wonder how much of this film I've actually seen, because it's a long film. And I was sort of like, it's like, I feel like I've seen it all, but I don't actually know. And I think it's funny. I've definitely seen sections, but now I've watched the whole thing and I'm like, no, I don't think I have seen it all. I've seen the stuff of them in the tunnel on their stomachs, going on the rails like that. I've definitely seen that, locked in my mind when I was rewatching it. And obviously Steve McQueen on the motorcycle at the end, I've definitely seen, but honestly, probably the first 2/3 of the film, I'd either only seen tiny sections of it, or not at all. So it was pretty fresh for me. I was really actually pleased that I was finally kind of filling this gap in my film. It's not my repertoire because I don't play the films.
Film resume.
It's not. They're not my films. They have nothing to do with me. My film
library.
If the films that we watch were on a shelf,
you have looked at
films that I have seen. Let's just, I don't know why it took me so long to get there.
It's definitely one of those top 100 films, right? For a lot of people.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Now, I have to say this as well. I know you haven't said anything yet, Ben, but I have one more thing to say. Last time, towards the end of the podcast, and we have video and audio evidence of this, but I haven't gone back to check. But I am pretty sure you were like, yes, The Great Escape, yes, The Great Escape, Paul Newman, yes. Paul Newman.
I've realized I mixed them up, eh?
And at the time, I wasn't confident enough to be like, Paul Newman's not in this movie, bro. But I felt it in my bones. And then I watched it. And I scoured those credits and I looked at those faces and I was like, there is no Paul Newman here.
No, there is. Yeah, no, I've realized I mixed up Steve McQueen and Paul Newman in my head. One makes salad dressing, one rides motorbikes. So I don't know how I've done that. But I think it's because Paul Newman is in like another prison movie. I forget the exact title of it. I was thinking about it while I was watching the film. But anyway, before we kick off, thank you for choosing this movie.
I kicked off ages ago. I don't know what you're talking about.
Before we kick off to it, I also want to just run down the quick facts. Directed by John Sturges, who also directed Magnificent Seven, The Eagle Has Landed, and Gunfight at the OK Corral. I love all those movies, just quietly. A screenplay by James Clavell, who was a POW in World War II in the Pacific. And W.R. Burnett, who mainly writes movies based on either his own books or other people's books. Which is what this is. Based on a book by Paul Bricknell, who is an Australian, who was a POW in the actual Great Escape. He wasn't one of the escapees because he was the one who actually developed claustrophobia and they didn't want to risk him panicking in the tunnel. So he was one of the tunnel diggers and things like that. Starring Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, James Donald, Charles Bronson, Donald Pleasance, and James Coburn, who is top 5 worst Australian accents on film.
Actually, you know what I noticed about James Coburn? I was looking at this dude for the first half of the movie and I was like, I know you, you know? And I was like, what do I know you from? Because it's not this. Sister Act 2. He's one of the monks in Sister Act 2.
Oh, he is too. That's wild. Do you know those moments where you're like, oh, I know a few movies he's in, and then you throw that out and I'm like, I just pictured him straight in my noggin.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing.
And he's hilarious in that movie
so
too.
Good.
Like
music and like one of those classic soundtracks by Elmer Bernstein. You mentioned this movie, and the first thing I think 90% of people will do is start humming the like that whole thing. Released June 20th, 1963, had a budget of $3.8 million, had a box office of $11.7 million, adjusted for modern day rates, that's a $110 million movie.
Yeah, they did well. They did well in the old returns there. So, and classic, so it's always going to continue to make bank after.
Yeah. And if anyone didn't watch this movie, it's literally a movie about people escaping from a POW camp. But it's kind of like the Avengers of people escaping from a POW camp. Because the whole idea of this film is they're sick of these people escaping, so they put them all in one camp to watch them all, which really seems like a horrible idea. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, the Nazis had a lot of bad ideas. And this isn't even like in the top 20 of them, but putting all the people who are best at escaping from a prison camp in a prison camp, stupid. Just stupid. You're only causing yourself a lot of mischief.
I have to say, I was sort of like, I did a lot of back and forth throughout the week as I sort of watched the movie and then reflected on the story, on the historical accuracy of the film, because it's a real mixed bag. Like, there were times in the week where I was like, this is completely fictionalized, and then I'd research more and learn a few facts and I'd be like, well, actually that part's not, but hey, this part over here that I thought was real is totally not. Like, so it was kind of, and the film alludes to that a little bit with its opening title, which it has the title which says that there are some composite characters, but the details of the escape are completely true, and they're not.
Well, there was an escape. The amount of people who died did die. The amount of people who escaped did escape. But kind of like everything in between is a composite of other escapes, other things that people experience. Like the writer of the book, James Clavell, he was in that camp at that time. And basically him and another guy realized, hey, we need to document what happened here because of all the people who did. Basically, spoilers, not spoiler, because you should have watched the movie. At the end of this movie, 50 people get straight up executed. Basically as a criminal war act, because they were captured. There was no need to execute them. They could have put them back in jail. But the Gestapo, being the Gestapo, said no more. So they decided that everything had to be documented. And they realized that the story they had, and then all the stories around the camp of all these other people who'd done escape attempts previous at other camps, needed to be recorded. So they kind of recorded them all. And they didn't have a lot of paper and pen to do that, because they were only supposed to be able to send letters and stuff. So they had to sneak paper and write down really small handwriting to get all this information in. So that's why a lot of this is a bit composited and a bit kind of jumbled in.
Yeah, it kind of felt like it's like, I mean, again, just from my sort of research, because I watched the film first and I didn't do any research because I wanted to experience the film and deal with the twists and turns. I didn't even know if they got out or if they got recaptured. I didn't know any of that stuff. Like, but prior to, I knew a little bit. I knew that they didn't all make it. I knew that, like, but I just didn't know any details. But then, so I watched it, and then afterwards sort of started then researching the real event, and it sort of feels like basically the first kind of, I don't know, 2/3 or just over half is probably, the most fictionalized, which is the build up and when they're in the camp,
Sort of
because
like
that's
the
a
character work.
exactly, yeah, there's a lot of interactions there, which are they're all interactions by composite characters who weren't actually, there's a few real people, but like, but it's that's the part that's very, very dramatized. And then basically once the night of the escape begins, it's pretty, there's a lot of detail there, which is pretty much exactly as it happened. The idea that there was an air raid and
Yeah.
power went out, they were 20 feet short of the woods and they couldn't, get there and they didn't know why. And, the fact that around 70 something men escaped and they were hoping for more like 200, all that stuff, all very true. And then it's sort of, once they finish the escape and they're on the run, then we're back to composite stuff again, where it's sort of like,
Well,
so it's just an interesting kind of thing. And so it's sort of like, it's like a lot of fictional stuff in the first 2/3, and then at the very end, after the escape happens, again a lot more fictional composited stuff, and then the escape's pretty
I
accurate.
was reading interviews because the RAF quite regularly airs this movie on anniversaries, right? And they quite often have survivors of POW camps and even survivors of that camp who had attended in the past. And apparently, they always talk about how the start of this movie, all about life in camp, even though that is all fictional, it's accurate as to what it was like. Like, it's almost like the most accurate to what it felt like to be in that camp, like the day-to-day life, the distractions and all that sort of stuff. Even though those individual events might not have happened, it's almost like when people talk about scrubs and doctors are like, yeah, those things didn't happen, but it's what it feels like to be in a hospital and working as a resident,
Yeah.
things like that. Same thing here.
Yeah, or like, but people say that about the West Wing too. They're
Yes.
like, it's nothing like that in the sense that we don't talk that fast and we're not that smart, but it feels like that.
Yeah. and that's what a lot of them were saying there. Okay. We're talking about fictionalization. There's two reasons I've read that are given to why a bunch of this stuff was written fantastically the way it was and not historically accurate. The first is they wanted it to play to American audiences. So
I feel like you can feel that,
so they
like,
kept American characters in there when in real life the Americans were shipped out 7 months before the escape attempt. There was only one American involved, and that's because he was serving in the British Army. So the American characters in that movie wouldn't have been there. And the other one is Steve McQueen. He took the role basically saying, I'll take the role if you write in stuff that I do with a motorcycle. Because he wanted to show off how good he was on the motorcycle, because he does everything on that motorcycle except the jump.
Well, I was reading about the jump, because the jump is like controversial in the sense that, like, it's weird because apparently, and I don't know if you read this as well, but like apparently they wouldn't let McQueen do the jump, right? Because the jump was too dangerous.
They wouldn't insure him.
They wouldn't insure it. So yeah, sure, someone else, a stuntman. I'm not sure exactly who.
He was
but,
his best friend, who
there
wasn't a
you go,
stuntman
right.
before this, but then became his stuntman.
Yeah, right. So this guy does the jump. Great, insurance covered. And then at lunch, McQueen does the jump for fun. Like, so it's sort of like, and so it's kind of like, well, you're not covered for insurance, but yeah, but it's lunchtime and I want to do it. So,
Look,
bam.
Early template for a bit of a Tom Cruise.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to do the stunt.
Yeah.
He even did the riding when the guy falls off from the wire on the road. That's him.
Yeah. It's pretty, like, the writing is good. I mean, look, if he wanted a sequence to say, like, hey, look how good I am on a motorcycle, I'm like, mission accomplished, Now I should say, by modern standards, it's not like a chase in that sense. It's more just like I'm watching someone, drive this, World War II era motorcycle very fast over these paddocks, which are very bumpy, uneven. He's catching air off the little hillocks. It looks difficult to do. It looks like hard riding.
Looks great.
Yeah, it looks great. Yeah. So, but look, so and obviously, and I think that's a great addition. Obviously, it's an iconic sequence. The jumping of the fence and that sort of part of the escape. But I also think it's an appropriate movie addition. For that point in the movie. So.
Well, that whole end part of that movie, you can count the amount of lines of dialogue on maybe both hands at most. So as soon as they escape and it's them kind of all going on their ways, there's the bits on the train, there's people cycling through, there's people flying planes. There's not a lot of dialogue spoke. It's all the tension of how far are each of these people going to get. They're not trying to draw attention to themselves because, of course, they're not speaking and all this sort of stuff. The only two that really speak a lot are James Garner's character with the guy who's blind.
Donald Pleasance. Yeah,
they talk a bit because he's blind and he has to describe things to him and stuff. But yeah, the whole end of that movie, there's not a lot of dialogue. And I think it just works so well. It just allows the action for what it is to speak for itself.
Yeah, and it definitely ups the tension. I will say as well, I was a little, because again, not knowing until afterwards, I did the research afterwards, I wasn't 100% sure, and I'll just be honest, for a lot of the movie, exactly where we were. Because, and then when you get to the end, and it actually gets more confusing because, you know, I was sort of like, okay, we seem to be in a French village at this point in time with this guy. So did this guy make it all the way to France or before? And how long has it been? And, you know, or is this just, you know, are these just French speaking people in Poland or like, you know, where exactly? So, and then sort of, yeah, so it was a little bit.
They compress a lot of time here. And I think the directors in that even admitted to it. Like, even like in the camp itself, events they're presenting that took maybe a year or like, they compressed everything. It was like what they did would have taken a very, very long time. And you couldn't have done it fast.
No, it's more just about like, I would think in a modern movie, like we've got a little bit more cinematic language now to actually communicate that perhaps a little bit more clearly. Like, do you know what I mean? That, you know, and whether it's something simple like a title card, you know, to say where we are location wise, or whether we do a few more contextual clues or to show that time has passed between, you know, this point in time and that point in time, like, or maybe I'm just stupid. Do you know what I mean? Like,
no,
that's, you know,
you're not. Especially the escape sequence itself and the days afterwards, the time does feel jumbled because they're cutting between so many different stories.
Yeah.
It feels like some of those stories went for a lot longer, yet they kind of shared the same amount of screen time in a strange way.
Yeah, I was sort of like, how did that guy get to, has it just been a couple of days? Because they nabbed all these other people and they put them in a, you know, prison cell chateau place. Do you know what I mean?
Presented as a simultaneous action when it wasn't.
Yeah, which I'm like, I get that it probably wasn't all happening exactly the same time, but I just would have, again, because now by this point of the film, I'm super interested, and I'm just like, how far did they get? Was that guy out for a week? What about that guy? Like, you know, like, so it was sort of a little bit, and it's not really a criticism. It's more just something where I was a little bit genuinely confused with regard to timings and locations and geography once we actually got out of the camp. You know, obviously, you know, Steve McQueen and James Garner's character are both separately making for Switzerland, you know, whereas James Coburn is trying to get to Spain. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, knowing Europe, I'm like, they're
not close.
France separates you know, Switzerland and Spain. So, and Germany's on the other side altogether. So I'm sort of like, how did James Coburn on his bike make it all the way to, how far did he, like, you know, so
trains. I think the answer is trains.
And that's it. Like, and then some guys were in the trains, some guys were down the river, you know, so obviously they all ended up.
Sorry, don't gloss over the river. How long were they rowing that boat?
Yeah.
They were out in the ocean, Tim.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm like, what? Like, you know.
And that's actually partly a true story. Those two people did escape by a rowboat and end up in Switzerland. But they were two Dutch guys. They weren't like They weren't old Charles Bronson and friends.
So yeah, I really enjoyed this film. One thing I was maybe surprised about, particularly again, because you've got to remember, I didn't know that 50 people got shot at the end of the movie, right? Like, so one thing that was I was watching it, and for most of the movie, it's quite, I guess, a romp. It's a light-hearted kind of romp. Like one character, Ives, gets shot at the midpoint of the film, and that's really the first bad thing to happen. Like, which there's a lot of lightness, and there's a lot of camaraderie, and there's a lot of jokes, and like, and I'm sure it was awful in that camp in reality, but as presented in the film, it's actually not that bad, you know. Like really,
It's almost a twist.
Yeah, it is almost a twist. It's
Yeah.
sort of like, it's this sort of like light kind of, you know, the Germans aren't that scary, you know, the camp's not really that bad. We're going to escape, but it's going to be fine. They're going to throw us back in, and that's sort of how it all goes, you know. It's a bit like, yeah, it's presented a little bit like, reminded me of Peter Pan, the Lost Boys and the Pirates, and it's like, you know, we catch you, and then we put you back, and then they catch us, and we put them, and then you take a turn. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
sure, Ives dies, and that's a little blip, and you're like, okay, it's a little bit darker than the rest of it, and then you get to the end, and it's just like massacre. Do you know what I mean? And suddenly it's sort of like, oh, this is like, now the film's completely done a gear shift, and we're in very serious sort of territory. Now, of course, we know just from history that, you know, those camps were awful places.
Yeah.
And obviously those ones, the POW ones, as presented there, weren't anywhere half as bad as the actual concentration camps, which
Or
were
even
also
the POWs in the Pacific with the Japanese.
right, you know, which, so we had all these other, so we're well aware of how bad the war is, and I'm certainly not saying
Yeah.
the actual war wasn't bad. I'm just saying, as presented in the film, you know, it was sort of this interesting thing where, you know, it was quite light for a lot of it as presented.
Well,
And
war movies back then did have, or a lot of them did have that vibe, right? There was that kind of, it wasn't presented as war is terrible. It was still almost presented in that war is an adventure kind of vibe. And it wasn't until a few years after this, and then you got like war movies made post-Vietnam and things like that, where you start getting a lot more nitty-gritty. You start getting people going back and telling like stories. I mean, you did have exceptions to that rule, like All Quiet on the Western Front, and some other movies like that. But yeah, there was always that kind of almost that serialization, that not Indiana Jones in so much that it was like an adventure movie, but like that kind of serial-esque filmmaking of like, hey, it's yeah, I don't know how to fully explain it.
in a lot of ways, it's almost a family film for it tonally, you know,
Yeah.
for most of the movie, except for these moments of violence. So I guess, you know, you could look at it as sort of saying, is this simply an attempt to appeal to a mass audience, you know?
Which I think is definitely it.
And that's obviously, that was quite successfully done. So, but it's certainly something where now, you know, with our modern sensibilities, it made me reflect. I was like, you would never see a World War II film now presented as anything but grim, you know, like, because I just feel that there's so much awareness out there of, you know, how bad of a time, you know, these two world wars were.
Also, audiences back then didn't want to see grim.
That's
the audience
true,
has
because
changed.
well, the other thing is the audiences. You think about it, 1963, the audience watching this war film lived
We're all
through
alive.
the war, like,
Yeah.
you know. So it's probably to watch a harrowing version, you know, probably wasn't the way to go. Like, if you lived it personally, you probably then don't want to go out on a Friday night to the movies and watch, you know what I mean? That's right. It was the worst experience of my life, you know? Whereas now we've got the distance, and it's more about the realism. So
The last time I watched this movie, I worked out I was maybe 13. For those playing at home, I am now 36.
You're so old. I'm nowhere near that old.
I misremembered a couple of things in this movie. If you'd had asked me before I watched this movie, I probably would have used Paul Newman instead of Steve McQueen. But I would have said he died. I had a fixed memory of his death when he jumps the fence. For some reason, maybe there's like pop culture media out there that has like taken that and twisted it, and I've remembered that instead. But yeah, I would have had him as a casualty in this movie, not a survivor. The other thing is I didn't remember how few actually stayed escaped.
Yeah.
Of like
Yeah.
the 75 people that escaped in the movie, only 3 made it to their final destinations.
Yeah, and it's and sure, I think it was something like get the numbers wrong, but it was like 17 or something that or maybe 11, between 11 and 17 who got returned to the camp and didn't
And then
actually die,
50
but
were executed.
and then 50 were executed. So it's but it's very few actually make it, and none of the if you like the leads, of the film, even they decided to not give their lead characters, like they could have made James Coburn's character a more prominent character and made him the lead, and then he escapes, but they decided not to go that way, obviously. So it's interesting because Steve McQueen surviving until the end of the film does send the audience out on a boost, like
For
which
what it is, yeah.
I needed it, like even I was like, yeah, just a bit of hope. That wry smile as he's like, you can
Goes
clearly,
back into the cooler.
he goes back into the cooler. He does his cool baseball against the wall, which how iconic is that? Like,
I mean, that's been replayed and redone in so many movies and TV shows.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Just done to death, but it's great to see the origin, of that really iconic movie moment. And then look, the wry smile that Steve McQueen gives to the new, Nazi commander, which is basically just like, I am going to give you hell, like is sort of the promise.
Over.
Yeah, that's right. Is sort of the promise. And then somehow, after all that sort of tragedy and really sort of hard stuff, the audience does manage to head out of the movie on a high. So, look, I really enjoyed this movie. I'm so glad we watched it, and I
have one more weird fact before we
do
finish. Did you know there's a sequel to this movie?
No.
It's called The Great Escape 2.
Of course it is.
Stars Christopher Reeve.
Okay.
Before the accident. I know that sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not truly a sequel. It's more of an extension. So they redo the escape, but they use all the real names. There's no composite characters.
Right.
And it's more about hunting down the Gestapo who executed the 50 men after the war.
Oh.
And prosecuting them. So in the movie where the men are executed, in the original movie, they're machine gunned all at once. That's not how it was done in real life. Apparently, they were shot with pistols in pairs, and then the last like 15 were machine gunned, which is horrible.
Right.
Yeah. So they kind of redid that film. It was actually directed by someone who starred in the original, which was the third American guy. What was his name? He's like, he wore the funny hat, like the little beanie.
Look, good luck to me remembering anyone's name, Ben.
Yeah,
I'm not going to.
It was by him. But yeah, so the last thing was the studios were scared of a couple of things in this movie. The one was Steve McQueen not being in it enough, because he does disappear for like half an hour in the middle of this movie because he's not there.
Yeah.
And the other was there was no female lead.
There's no female characters at all in the movie.
And of the time, that was very, very strange. The great starlets were in all these movies, right?
Mm.
They always had a role, and they even got to the point where it was like, hey, like when such and such dies, can he just be cradled by a woman? And they're like, no, like they just fought back out. That's not the story we're telling. Like, that's not what happened. But yeah,
even now, no studio would want that now. No. Like,
there would be a German woman from the village who helps them, or there'd be something.
Like, it's just an entirely same-gendered cast. Is it's pretty unique. It's pretty unusual. But obviously, if you're telling this story, this is the only way to do it. Like it doesn't make any sense to have female characters.
Fantastic pick, Tim. Like literally a legendary pick. Thank you so much. Do you have anything more to say before I get on to our next film?
I don't, but I just enjoyed it, Ben, and I'm a little bit scared for what's coming next because I don't feel like you're going to respond in kind.
I could, but it's actually up to you.
Oh no!
So you made something up to me last time. I'm going to
Yeah.
make something up to you.
All right.
I'm going to play a game called OG or the Remake.
Okay.
So you can pick the original or the remake of this movie, and we're going to watch that.
All right. I am
There's a good choice here, Tim.
okay. I'm continuing to feel classy.
Yeah.
And I'm sticking with it, and I'm gonna assume that the classier choice will be the original. So I'm picking the original version.
You have picked the original Total Recall.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Total Recall.
And then the remake is so bad.
Actually, I like the remake too.
Oh,
you know,
it's
like
not
them.
the same movie.
I like them both, you know. But look, I am psyched and thrilled to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall. Can't wait, in fact. So, yeah, it's a complete knee jerk from The Great Escape.
Well, well, I was mowing my lawn and I was listening to another podcast, a science podcast, and they were talking about landing on the moon and landing on Mars. And one of them's like, oh man, blah, 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 just like in Total Recall. And I just had this moment like, oh man, that movie's so good. That movie's like the best movie. And I instantly just grabbed my phone, write in notes, Total Recall next movie. And then over like the week, I've been thinking, well, no, we could actually do either Total Recall. I'll make Jim choose.
Nice.
So that's how we went there. But yeah, so next week, Total Recall. Thank you for The Great Escape, Jim.
No problem.
Just the worst. But anyway.
Total Recall it is. And
Total
perhaps
Recall it is.
You will recall my name correctly.
I will recall your name correctly. All right, man. Thank you so much. And see you next week.
Bye.